Hello guys, and welcome to this new video on LangChain JS. So chances are if you clicked on this video, then you already know what exactly LangChain JS is. But just in case you don't, no problem. Let's understand what LangChain JS is all about. So in order to start talking about LangChain JS, we need to first talk about LangChain itself without the JS. LangChain is a framework designed for building applications powered by language models. So what this simply means is that LangChain is a framework that you use as a developer when you want to create applications that interact with language models. There are so many types of language models outside. Popular ones are the GPT series. We have GPT-4, 5 and so on. We also have Llama and the Llama series. We have Grok. So language models are simply those, I would call them in common language, those AI that are able to answer questions that humans ask to them. Popular applications that use language models are things like chatbots, like ChatGPT, for example, which is a common example, is an application that you can use and type in your question or any query you have, and you send it to the language model. So ChatGPT that you see as a chatbot is simply an application that is responsible for receiving your questions and sending to the language model. So when you type your answer in ChatGPT, for example, ChatGPT is not the one itself that answers the question, but what they do is they forward your question to a language model, which can be something, for example, like GPT-5 or GPT-4. Those GPTs are the actual language models that receive the questions and answer, but ChatGPT is simply the interface that you see to type in your question. So if you want to create an application similar to that, it must not be a chatbot, but simply any application that may have to get your users or maybe yourself even to type a question that is going to be answered by an AI, then you will need to use a language model to do that. And LangChain is a framework that simply enables us to add it into our applications to easily interact with these language models in order for them to answer questions received by our application. Now that we have spoken about LangChain, LangChain JS on the other hand is the JavaScript version or implementation of this LangChain framework. So LangChain is a framework that can be used in various languages, but I think its primary language is Python. And then LangChain JS now was the JavaScript implementation of this same framework using JavaScript instead of Python. So the main difference is just in the programming language used, but their functionalities are exactly the same. So if you know JavaScript already as your maybe favorite programming language, or the programming language you know well, you might consider wanting to use LangChain JS specifically. Now in this video we are going to be using LangChain JS for JavaScript developers in order to interact with language models. Now that we already know what LangChain JS is all about, let's try writing some code to practice using LangChain JS. So in order to start, I will first create a new folder in my computer in my home directory, and I'm going to call this LangChain tutorial, LangChain JS tutorial. Now that I've created my folder, I will simply drag and drop this to import to VS Code, which is my code editor I am using. And by the way, for this video, I am assuming that, or the prerequisite I will say for this video is that you should at least know the basics of programming in JavaScript, and you should know basic tools used in programming, like things like code editors, IDEs, how to install a code editor or an IDE. We are not going to be going through all of that. I am assuming you are already up to a certain level at this in programming, just a little above a complete beginner, I would say. So now that I have imported the project to my code editor, we can start our practice. The first thing is I will open my terminal, my VS Code terminal, and then I'm going to initialize a Node project. So you should also have Node.js installed, a recent version at this. Me, I have Node.js version 22. As of the time I'm recording this video, that is one of the most recent versions, I think. So I will initialize a Node.js project by running the command npm init-y. So this command simply initializes our node project and creates our package.json file, which we see here, that contains information about this node project. Okay guys, so now since we already have our package.json which has been created upon initialization of our node project, we can now go and start writing our codes that interact with our language models using LangChain. But before we do that, we need to first install the packages that we are going to use in order to carry out this experiment. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to be using the Grok language model, which is the language model associated with Twitter or X. So we are going to be using Grok in this video because it is the best free alternative that I could find. Before trying out Grok, I tried OpenAI and even Google Gemini, but those ones are paid. So for everybody to be able to follow on, we are going to use Grok because it has a completely free tier. Even if you don't have any credit card, any bank account or anything, you can still use it. So we are going to be using Grok, as I said, for this video. And in order to use Grok, we have to install the package that allows us to use LangChain Grok, as I said. So I will say npm I for install, and then I will say at LangChain. So at LangChain means we want to use the LangChain framework, and I will write a slash, and after this slash I'm going to use the particular language model provider, which is Grok, that we are going to use. So I will say Grok, Grok, which stands for Grok. So Grok itself is not actually the language model, but it is the language model provider, meaning that it is the company that is going to give us access to the language models which we are going to actually use. And after installing Grok, I want to also install .env. It's another package which we are going to use in our project, and I will run the command to install both. Okay guys, now we can see that our installations have been done successfully, and we have a small warning here, but don't worry about this much. It's an internal warning for the Grok package, so it's not really something to worry about for now, and we can simply continue with our video. We have also been added the node modules folder and the package log.json file too. Okay, now so once we have already installed the LangChain and Grok package, we will need to access Grok in order to use the language models provided by Grok. So in order to do that, we need a path which enables us to interact with these language models via Grok, and for that we will need something known as an API key. So an API key is a sort of authorization that you get from the Grok website in order to be able to pass through them to interact with the various language models which we can use. And in order to get this API key, you simply need to open your browser and head to the domain console.grok.com, and when you open this website, you will be asked to authenticate in the authenticate page, which I will do. As you can see, you can log in with Google, GitHub, SSO, or even email. So you can choose any of these options, and if you have not yet had any account with this, you can simply create a new account also. So I already have an account, so I will simply log in with Google, and here I am taken to my home page under my account, and inside here, this is a small navbar we have. I will go to API keys, and you can see I have one API key which I already created while I was trying out this before making this video. So to create your own API key, you can click on this API key button, create API key, and then you're going to give an API key name like learning LangChain. You can give any name that you want, and then expiration, you choose no expiration. So expiration simply means the period of time this API key will be available for. Now once I finish this, I will click on submit, and here you have the API key provided. The API key is simply this long text or long string of text that we have here. it is very important to copy it and save it somewhere you know you will remember, or somewhere you know you'll be able to find it after, because this API key you will not be able to access it like this any other time again. And I will click on done. Now I have my new API key created, is the same name. I can delete this previous one from here, but I will not delete it, I will leave it for now. Now I am going to click on this create file icon or new file icon, and I will create a new file which is .env. So the .env file is accompanied with the .env package which we installed earlier, and this is simply a file that helps us to store secret variables in our code. That means a variable whose value we don't want to make accessible or seen by everyone, we can store that variable in a .env file, and then we access it inside our code without actually seeing the value of that variable. So inside this, we usually write the variable names in capital letters. So I will say grok_API. Remember, variable names don't have spaces in between them, so I will use the underscore to link the different words. So I have grok API key, and I will set this equal to the API key I earlier copied from the grok website, and I'm going to paste the API key here. This is supposed to be a secret key, so you are not supposed to share it with anyone. That is why mine is hidden out, as you will see in the video, but you simply paste yours and you save this file. Now I will go back to my new file icon and create another file in which we will be writing our actual JavaScript code. So I will call this app.js, and this is where the magic will now happen, or where we will do the actual fun stuff. Now the first thing I will do here is to import the required libraries which we will have to use in our code. These required libraries are the ones we installed earlier, which are the LangChain grok and the .env libraries. So for the grok package, I will save it in a constant variable, and we write it within curly braces, and then I will call it the name chat grok, and I will set this to require. And now we are going to write the name of the package which we installed, which was at LangChain. We can see VS Code already gives me the option to auto complete here. I will simply say LangChain grok. So what this line does, it is simply imports our LangChain grok package, and it saves it in this constant variable called chat grok. So this name chat grok is the standard name we usually use when using grok as our model, because it is a class name that has already been predefined inside the grok package. So we have to use the same name just as it is. And then I will also import my .env simply by writing require and then .env, and after that I will say .config. So what this line does is that it simply goes to this our .env file, and then it loads or imports all the environment variables inside it. What we mean by environment variables are simply the variables stored inside the .env file which we want to use inside our program, so that anytime we access any or we write any of these variable names, our Node.js is going to know that this variable which we are referencing is from the .env file, even if we don't create it again inside this app.js file. Now the next thing we have to do is initialize the grok model. I will give a bit of spacing here. So we have this chat grok that I wrote above here, and I said it was a standard name defined in the grok package. We have to reference it here in this instance. And this chat grok, what it is exactly is, it's a class which has various attributes or properties inside of it. And now for those who are familiar with object-oriented programming, in order to be able to use a class, we need to create an instance of that class, or we need to create an object of the class, in other words. So I will create an instance of this class which will be a variable that I will call model, and I will set it to new chat grok. So this is what I mean by creating an instance of the class. Now we're able to have the properties of this chat grok class, and we will be using it in the variable called model, and this will be followed by a set of parentheses and curly braces in between it. Now we can access all the attributes or properties of this chat grok class, and the first property it has is the API key property. We have the API key property, and I will follow it with a colon to give the value of this API key property. Now for this API key, I want to say process process.env, and then when I write process.env, it means I want the value of this API key to come from my .env file. And after that, I will now say dot and give the exact environment variable which we want to access its value, because in our .env file there could be many other environment variables inside of it. So I will say I want in particular the Grok API key and comma. Now I will go to the next line and I can access the next attribute of this class, which is the model attribute. Now this model attribute is where we are going to choose the particular LLM we want to access or we want to ask our questions to. Here I am going to choose the model called Llama 3.37. We can see the name has been suggested. I will click on enter to complete it. Llama 3.3-70B versatile. So this one is the free model which is offered to us by Grok in order to be able to send requests for free. There are many other models which you can use which may be more expensive than this, but this one is just good for what we want to accomplish in this video. I will now add the next attribute, which is the temperature attribute. So temperature is an attribute in our model that specifies how creative we want this model to be. It can have a value between 0 to 1. So 0 is a value which means it is going to give very straightforward and robotic answers. But if we say 1, it means we want to give this model the freedom to be creative with its answers, meaning that it can add some extra stuff or maybe some playful stuff even in its response, making it more human-like, I can say, as compared to 0. But we can also give any other value between 0 and 1, which can be 0.1 or 0.4 or 5, which I'm going to stick with. So we can give any value between 0 and 1, as I said, and this is simply going to determine how creative, as I said, this model is going to be. Now we have already created our model, and this model is an instance of the ChatGrok class, as I said, and it is what is going to enable us to actually send requests. Now that we have the Grok model initialized, let's now send a request to our LLM with this model. So in order to do that, I will simply access the model object and then I will say dot invoke. Dot invoke is a method of the ChatGrok class of which we have created the instance called model, and inside this invoke method, this is where we actually pass our prompt or our query that we want to send to the LLM in order to get a response in return. So I can simply pass any sentence or any question I want here. I will pass a question which will be written within double quotes because the question is sent as a string, and inside here I'm going to send the question, who is the greatest football player of all time? Now when we pass this question, what we want to do is also that after sending our question, we would like to get a response, or we would like to see the response to the question which our LLM has sent. So in order to do that, I will store this request inside a variable. I will declare a variable called response and I will set it equal to this, and on the next line now I will display or print this response. So here in my console.log, I have set generated text. This is, I'm concatenating this message generated text to show that every time we see this in our terminal, we are going to know that this is the response that has been generated by the AI or by the LLM. And followed by this, I will now display the actual response, which is going to be response, which is the variable we stored our response in, and I will say response.content. We are saying response.content because this response is going to be returned as an object, and this object has so many properties, and we want to access the content property of this object in particular because this is what actually has the text that contains the answer to our question. So let's save this and I will run the program. Let me first clear everything that's now in our terminal to clear space, and I will run this program using the command node followed by the name of our JS file, which is app. You must not add the JS at the end. Now our question has been sent and we have had the answer back. We can see that we have so many things here, but we should not focus on this deprecation warning. It does not concern us. So what we should focus on is the generated text, we see that when we see generated text, we can identify that this is where our response actually begins. And we see generated text undefined. This undefined we get is what is supposed to be the value of this response.content, but we get the value undefined. This is because when we send our question using the model.invoke method, the next line after, which is displaying the response, was executed before our invoke function had the time to send our question or our request to Grok for it to process it and give us back a response. So this happens very often where you send a request or a question, and since most programming languages like JavaScript are executed line by line, once we write this line and cross it, we go to the next line and it starts executing the next line. We don't have the time to wait for everything to finish. That is why our response is undefined. But in order to solve this problem, JavaScript makes it easy for us by the use of asynchronous functions. An asynchronous function is a function that we can write our code within it, or a particular piece of code like this particular line where we are sending our request, and we make sure that this request must be sent and processed successfully, and we get back the result before we move to the next line of the program. So in order to do that, I will send my request within the asynchronous function. An asynchronous function begins with async, and then we write function. I will simply call this function my request, and within the function I will copy this line and paste in it. I will actually cut the line completely because I don't want it to stay under again, and I will paste this line inside the function. And also the last line where we are displaying the generated text, I will cut it and add inside the function too. And now the objective of putting this inside the function is because we wanted that the response should be invoked and sent, and we get back the result before we print anything. So in order to do that, we are going to write await in front of model.invoke. Now the await in asynchronous function means we want to tell our program to wait for this particular line or this particular process to be done and executed completely before we move to the next thing. This is going to help us to solve the problem we had before, where we had an undefined answer because of the fact that our request wasn't processed completely before the response was printed. Now I think with this we have solved that problem, and since we have written this within a function, if you run the program like this, nothing will happen. We need to actually call the function before what is inside the function gets displayed. So I will say my function, or my request, which was the name of the function I mean. So simply writing the function name followed by the parenthesis is going to run the function. Now let's save this and run the program again. Okay, now let me increase the size of our terminal screen to see the response better. Now we can see that we actually get an actual response from our LLM. So we see the response begins where we have generated text, and the response says the question of who is the greatest football player of all time is a matter of debate among football fans, and so on and so on. You can pause the video to read the response, or if you are trying this out, you can read in your own computer. But we can see some of the most cited candidates for the title of greatest football player of all time include Lionel Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo, Diego Maradona, Johan Cruyff, Pelé, and so on. And we even have some honorable mentions here: Zinedine Zidane, Andres Iniesta, Xavi Hernandez, and so on. So this is our response. You can clap for yourself. You have officially used LangChain to generate a response from an LLM. Now, even though what we have done is successful, we can improve on this code a little bit, which I am going to do. One modification I want to make is that we can see where we have this line of model.invoke, we are directly passing our question or our request inside this invoke as a string. Now this is not the best way to do it, because we may want to rather store our request inside a variable, and inside the invoke now we simply write the name of that variable. This enables us, this is better because of the advantages of using variable itself, which is it prevents repetition inside our code, meaning that if we have to write the same request several times, we simply need to access that same variable and have the request instead of having to type out this whole sentence every time. So for that reason, I would prefer to store our prompts within a variable. So I will cut this from here, from the invoke method or function, and then out of the function I'm going to declare a variable called prompt, which is going to contain our prompt text. Inside our invoke function, we need to pass it as a parameter in our function, which is my request. So I will make this my request to take a parameter which is going to be prompt. I can call this parameter something different from the actual variable name prompt, but for now I will just leave it like that. And since this takes a parameter in our function call, we need to also pass the prompt as an argument. So what this means is that we have this function prompt that contains whatever we want to give as prompt, and I will take this variable prompt and pass as an argument to my request function. Because this my request function takes a parameter or requires a parameter for it to be run, and I will change the spelling of this. I misspelled it, so I'll add the p where it is supposed to be added. Now we are receiving the prompt parameter in our function, so we can simply pass this in the model.invoke, because currently as we have model.invoke with the parentheses, nothing is being passed inside here. So I will write prompt to show that this is what is supposed to be passed as request. So we have done the same thing we had. I will change the question in our request to something else, just so we can experiment with other questions. And here I'm going to change the question to something else. I will ask, who is Tangang Kevin? That is my actual name. So I want to see if the AI or the LLM is going to have any idea of who I am. So I will save this. Let's first clear our terminal again, because the previous response was so long. And now we see the generated response. After generated text, it says, I couldn't find any information on a person named Tangang Kevin. It's possible that this person is a private individual or not a public figure, or the name might be misspelled or whatsoever. So long story short, the LLM has no idea of who I am. No problem. Anyways guys, you have seen how to use LangChain in order to interact with an LLM.